In the spring of 1838, officials in Charleston County quietly recorded a discovery they never intended to explain. Inside a coastal South Carolina plantation ledger were the names of 12 enslaved children, each described with the same unsettling details: pale skin, blue eyes, light hair. What disturbed the record keepers was not their appearance alone, but what followed. Within weeks, every one of those children vanished from the slave rolls. No deaths, no escapes, no sales recorded as slaves. Instead, a single word appeared beside each name: reclassified. Before we continue, I need to ask you something. If stories like this, stories history tried to erase, pull you in, then subscribe to Born into Darkness, hit the bell icon and stay with us. And when this story ends, tell me in the comments how deeply it affected you, because what you're about to hear was never meant to be remembered. South Carolina in the early 19th century was a place where order was worshipped more faithfully than truth, where every human being was measured, named, classified, and reduced to ink marks in ledgers that pretended permanence, and it is within this rigid obsession with categorization that the story truly begins. Because in the spring of 1838, just as the coastal air grew heavy with salt and blooming jasmine, county officials in Charleston District encountered something that did not fit the system they were sworn to preserve, something that unsettled them not because it was new, but because it was undeniable, as plantation birth records from several neighboring estates began to show the same disturbing pattern emerging almost simultaneously. Enslaved women giving birth to children whose appearance contradicted everything the racial laws claimed to enforce. Infants with pale, almost translucent skin, untouched by the sun, hair ranging from sandy brown to near blonde, and eyes described in careful, uneasy handwriting as blue, gray, or light, descriptors rarely, if ever, applied to those legally classified as property, and at first these entries were dismissed as clerical errors, the kind that happened when overworked scribes copied notes from midwives who themselves lacked formal education, but the pattern refused to disappear, because these were not isolated entries scattered across decades. They were clustered within months, within the same plantations, sometimes within the same slave quarters, forcing officials to confront a truth they had long pretended did not exist. The racial boundary that defined their society was not natural, not fixed, and certainly not respected by those who held the most power within it. And while the public language of the time spoke endlessly of purity, honor, and Christian stewardship, the private records told a quieter, far more dangerous story, one written between the lines of plantation life, where white men moved without restriction and enslaved women had no legal right to refuse. And yet even that reality was not what truly alarmed the authorities. Because exploitation was expected, tolerated, and absorbed into the economic machinery of slavery, what terrified them was visibility, the fact that these children made the invisible visible, that their bodies themselves were evidence of transgressions the law was designed to deny, and so the discovery was handled with extraordinary discretion, never announced publicly, never discussed in newspapers or court proceedings, but circulated quietly through correspondence between clerks, physicians, and plantation owners, each letter more cautious than the last, each phrase to minimize what could not be erased, with doctors instructed to avoid detailed descriptions, midwives warned against unnecessary commentary, and overseers reminded that their role was observation, not interpretation. And yet, despite these efforts, the records continued to accumulate, each pale-skinned child born into bondage acting like a fracture spreading through the foundation of the system that depended on the illusion of absolute difference. And it is important to understand that South Carolina at this time was not merely a slaveholding society, it was a slave society, one whose wealth, political power, and identity were inseparable from the institution itself, meaning that any threat to its logic was treated as a threat to survival, and race was the logic upon which everything rested, not culture, not language, not religion, but blood, quantified through ancestry laws so strict that a single African ancestor, no matter how distant, rendered a person legally black forever. And yet here were children whose appearance suggested the opposite calculation. whose faces mirrored those of the very families who claimed ownership over them, creating a contradiction the law could not reconcile without exposing its own fiction. And so the question was never how these children came to be, because everyone involved already knew the answer. The question was how to neutralize them before their existence forced that answer into the open, and county officials began quietly reviewing plantation rolls, cross-referencing births with known household movements, noting which estates had recently hosted extended visits from relatives, business partners, or political allies. Because these children did not appear randomly, they followed the paths of power, emerging where oversight was weakest and authority most concentrated, and even then, no formal investigation was ever launched, because to investigate would be to acknowledge culpability, and culpability at that level threatened the entire social order. So instead, the discovery was reframed internally as a logistical problem rather than a moral one, discussed in terms of classification anomalies and record inconsistencies, language deliberately stripped of human meaning. And as weeks passed, a consensus formed among the men tasked with maintaining order. These children could not remain where they were, not because they posed a physical danger, but because they embodied a conceptual one. Their presence disrupted the visual shorthand of slavery, where skin color alone was meant to communicate status, and if that shorthand failed, even briefly, it invited questions from those the system relied upon being unquestioning: poor whites, overseers, and even enslaved people themselves, who might begin to see the boundary, not as destiny, but as construction, and construction can be dismantled. And so the decision was made quietly, without debate or recorded vote, that these children would be removed from the slave rolls altogether, not sold in the traditional sense, not transferred like livestock or labor, but reclassified, a word that appears suddenly in the margins of several plantation ledgers from that year, written smaller than the rest, sometimes in different ink, sometimes without signature, as if even the clerks understood the danger of leaving their names attached to it. And this reclassification was not emancipation, not freedom in any moral sense, but administrative erasure, a way of making the problem disappear by altering the paperwork rather than confronting the reality. And once that decision was made, events moved swiftly, because delay risked attention, and attention risked exposure. And so within days of birth, sometimes before the child had even been named, arrangements were made through networks that operated just beyond official oversight, involving distant relatives, sympathetic physicians, or families seeking heirs without scrutiny, and the children were removed quietly, often at night, leaving behind no public trace except a single amended line in a ledger, while the mothers were told nothing or given explanations so vague they bordered on cruelty. And in this way, the discovery that should have unraveled the system instead revealed its true strength, not in justice or righteousness, but in its ability to adapt, to absorb contradiction without collapse, by, say, sacrificing truth to preserve power. And as you continue listening, remember this moment, because everything that follows, every disappearance, every silence, every lie built upon another, begins here, with the choice not to ask the one question that mattered. And before we go deeper, if stories like this, stories buried deliberately, stories that expose how history protected itself, matter to you, then stay with Born into Darkness, because what begins as a discovery will soon become a pattern, and that pattern will leave scars far deeper than any record ever admitted. What followed the quiet reclassification of those infants was not relief but escalation, because removing the children solved only the immediate visual contradiction, not the deeper instability they introduced. And in the months that followed, plantation owners across South Carolina began behaving differently, more cautiously, more privately, as if aware that something once invisible had crossed into dangerous proximity with daylight. And while no official decree was ever issued, an unspoken protocol spread through whispered conversations at courthouse steps, churchyards, and private dinners, a protocol designed to ensure that such discoveries would never again reach the level of county concern, beginning with tighter control over enslaved women's movements, stricter supervision of birthing quarters, and, most significantly, an insistence that births be reported with less descriptive detail, reducing living human beings to numbers and labor projections rather than bodies with features that could betray inconvenient truths. And yet, even these precautions could not fully contain what had already been set in motion, because the children who had been removed did not simply vanish into nothingness. They were sent somewhere, placed into households that had agreed, sometimes eagerly, sometimes reluctantly, to raise them as white, and that decision, more than any other, exposed the true fragility of the racial order, because it proved that whiteness itself was not an immutable state of being, but a performance sustained by collective agreement, clothing, education, and silence, and for the families who accepted these children, the bargain was clear. They would receive a child who could inherit, marry, and move freely through society, but only if the origin of that child was never questioned, never spoken, never even privately acknowledged in writing, and so a second layer of secrecy was built atop the first, thicker and more deliberate, binding not just plantation owners, but merchants, ministers, midwives, and distant relatives into a shared conspiracy of omission. And this conspiracy reshaped lives in subtle but permanent ways, because the children themselves grew up sensing the careful choreography surrounding them, the way certain questions were redirected, the way older family members stiffened at mention of ancestry, the way no baby portraits were displayed, no stories of early childhood shared, and though they were taught to read, to pray, to recite family lineages that were never quite complete, they also learned instinctively what not to ask, absorbing silence as part of their inheritance, and back on the plantations, the mothers left behind experienced a different, quieter transformation, one that never entered the records at all, because they had lost children not to death, which slavery understood how to process, but to erasure, a loss that could not be mourned publicly, acknowledged privately, or even named accurately, and some were told their child had been sold south, others that the infant had died in the night, explanations delivered with rehearsed detachment, while the truth, that their child had crossed a boundary forbidden to them forever, remained unspoken, hanging in the air of the quarters like a ghost that could never be laid to rest. And this unacknowledged grief became another unrecorded cost of maintaining the illusion of order, because a system that dead on silence required constant emotional labor from those it oppressed, labor that produced no profit but preserved stability, and as years passed, the initial discovery faded from immediate memory. But its consequences continued to ripple outward, shaping legal interpretations and social practices in ways that would only become apparent much later, because once it had been demonstrated that a child born enslaved could be legally transformed into white through paperwork alone, the law had effectively admitted that race was not purely biological but administrative, a fact that terrified legislators even as they quietly exploited it, tightening definitions on one hand while bending them on the other, creating exceptions so narrow they could be denied publicly while used privately, and nowhere was this contradiction more evident than in inheritance disputes, where whispered rumors occasionally surfaced about heirs whose legitimacy depended entirely on the success of that early reclassification, leading judges to rule decisively in favor of silence, not truth, because truth threatened precedent, and precedent threatened property, and property was the cornerstone upon which the entire system rested. And yet, despite all this effort, the story refused to stay buried, resurfacing in fragments decades later through letters never meant to be read, marginal notes in Bibles, and the uneasy recollections of descendants who inherited wealth alongside unanswered questions, because silence does not erase history, it merely delays its reckoning. And even within the enslaved community, knowledge circulated quietly, carried in coded language, in warnings passed from mother to daughter, in the shared understanding that the boundary between bondage and freedom was enforced not by nature but by power, and that power could, under certain circumstances, rearrange reality itself. And this understanding fostered a complex mix of resentment, fatalism, and quiet defiance, because if a child could be taken and made white, then whiteness was not divine destiny but theft, a stolen status guarded by violence and law. And as the 1840s approached, with abolitionist pressure mounting beyond South Carolina's borders, the state doubled down on its internal controls, passing stricter laws against manumission, tightening patrols, and reinforcing racial codes, all while privately continuing the same practices that had produced the pale-skinned children in the first place, creating a society locked in self-contradiction, publicly obsessed with purity, privately dependent on transgression. And it is within this tension that the true legacy of the discovery begins to take shape, not as a single scandal or moral awakening, but as a system learning how to survive exposure by perfecting denial, teaching itself how to absorb evidence of its own hypocrisy without collapse. And in the next part of this story, that denial will be tested again, not by infants hidden away in ledgers, but by adults whose lives straddle the boundary that was never meant to be crossed, forcing South Carolina to confront the long-term consequences of selling children into whiteness and pretending they had never been born. By the time those children reached adulthood, the illusion that had protected them began to thin in ways no ledger or whispered agreement could fully control, because adulthood brought visibility, and visibility invited scrutiny, especially in a society obsessed with lineage, bloodlines, and the unbroken purity of names that carried weight across counties and generations. And as these young men and women stepped into drawing rooms, courtships, apprenticeships, and inheritances, they carried with them an unspoken instability that others could sense without being able to name, a faint dissonance that revealed itself not in their faces, which matched expectations perfectly, but in the gaps of their histories, the missing relatives, the strangely silent childhoods, the absence of a eternal grandmother, or a birthplace spoken of only in vague geographic terms. And in South Carolina, where memory functioned as social currency, these omissions did not go unnoticed. They were merely handled delicately, because asking the wrong question could destabilize not just one family but many, and so curiosity was tempered by self-preservation. Yet that restraint did not prevent suspicion from taking root, and once suspicion existed, it had a way of spreading quietly, especially among those whose own status depended on the rigidity of racial boundaries. Because if whiteness could be acquired rather than inherited, then the entire hierarchy stood on something far more fragile than divine order. It stood on collective agreement, and that realization unsettled even those who benefited from it. And so rumors began to circulate, not loudly, not in public forums, but in the soft spaces between conversations, in glances exchanged during church services, in the careful pauses that followed a name spoken just a little too often. And for the individuals at the center of this unspoken scrutiny, life became a constant exercise in vigilance, because they understood, often without being told explicitly, that their security depended on flawless conformity, that any deviation, an unconventional marriage choice, a financial misstep, a public disagreement, could invite deeper examination, and deeper examination could unravel everything. And so many of them lived cautiously, marrying early into respectable families, avoiding public controversy, embracing roles that reinforced normalcy, and yet even perfect adherence could not fully protect them from moments when the past brushed too close to the present, moments like encountering an enslaved person whose face mirrored their own in unsettling ways, or hearing a plantation name spoken with a familiarity that stirred something unplaceable in their chest, or noticing the sudden silence of elders when certain topics arose. And these moments accumulated, forming an internal awareness that something fundamental had been taken from them, not freedom, which they possessed, but truth, which had been withheld in exchange for safety, and that theft left a residue of unease that could not be fully erased by privilege. And meanwhile, the enslaved community carried its own parallel awareness, because while names and records had been altered, memory had not, and stories of children taken and never returned remained alive in whispered recollections, shaping how enslaved people understood both whiteness and freedom, not as distant abstractions but as states that could be forcibly imposed or removed. And this understanding sharpened their perception of hypocrisy, because they could see, more clearly than most, that the rules governing race were enforced selectively, bent when convenient, hardened when challenged, and this perception fueled a quiet but growing skepticism toward the moral authority claimed by those in power, skepticism that did not yet manifest as open rebellion, but as something more dangerous in the long term: disbelief. And disbelief, once it takes hold, erodes obedience at its core. And as the 1850s approached, bringing with them intensified national debates over slavery, fugitive laws, and sectional identity, South Carolina found itself increasingly defensive, doubling down on narratives of natural hierarchy, even as its own practices contradicted them. And in this climate, the existence of white-presenting individuals with enslaved origins became an unspoken threat, because abolitionists seized upon such stories as proof that race was a social construct enforced by violence rather than biology, while pro-slavery advocates worked tirelessly to suppress any evidence that might support that argument, leading to a paradoxical situation in which the state both relied on and feared the flexibility of its own racial definitions. And this fear manifested in stricter surveillance of births, harsher punishments for perceived boundary violations, and an intensified emphasis on genealogy among white families, as if documenting ancestry more thoroughly could retroactively stabilize a system already compromised. And yet, even as these measures were enacted, they could not undo what had already happened, because the children sold as white were no longer children. They were participants in society, forming relationships, producing descendants, and extending the consequences of that original decision forward into generations yet unborn. And with each generation, the origin point became more distant, easier to obscure, harder to trace, transforming what had once been an emergency solution into a permanent alteration of the social fabric. And it is here that the story shifts from scandal to legacy, because the question is no longer how the system responded to the discovery of pale-skinned enslaved children, but how it lived with the knowledge that such discoveries had occurred and been resolved through denial rather than justice, and that knowledge lingered like a suppressed fever, flaring up occasionally in court cases, inheritance disputes, and sudden acts of violence that seemed disproportionate until viewed through the lens of fear, because fear, more than cruelty, became the primary engine driving enforcement. Fear that the lie would unravel, fear that the boundary would dissolve, fear that those who had been excluded would expose the arbitrariness of the exclusion itself. And this fear did not dissipate with time, it intensified, because every year that passed made the consequences more entrenched and the cost of acknowledgement higher, until eventually the system reached a point where it could no longer afford the truth, not morally but structurally, because truth would require dismantling not just individual injustices, but the entire framework that had normalized them. And so the lie was maintained, passed down, institutionalized, and defended with increasing desperation, setting the stage for a reckoning that would not come quietly or cleanly, because when a society builds itself on silence, the eventual sound of that silence breaking is never gentle, and in the next movement of this story, that pressure will finally find an outlet, not through official channels or polite discourse, but through events that force the buried past into undeniable confrontation, revealing how far South Carolina was willing to go to protect a racial order already undermined by its own choices. The pressure that had been building beneath South Carolina's carefully maintained silence did not erupt all at once, but instead leaked into the open through a series of moments so ordinary on the surface that no single one seemed capable of destabilizing an entire system. Yet together they formed a slow, grinding exposure that officials could neither fully control nor openly acknowledge. Because as the children who had been sold as white matured into adults and then into parents themselves, the question of inheritance emerged as the most dangerous point of contact between truth and denial, since land, money, and titles required documentation, and documentation invited scrutiny, and scrutiny inevitably brushed against origins that had been deliberately obscured, leading to contested wills, suspicious bequests, and whispered challenges that surfaced in courtrooms where judges were forced to balance law against custom and custom against fear, because to rule incorrectly was to invite questions that could not be contained within a single case. And so compromises became common, rulings delivered with vague language and sealed records, decisions that preserved outcomes without clarifying reasons, reinforcing a legal culture that operated as much on implication as on statute. And while this approach prevented immediate collapse, It also taught those paying attention that the system could be bent if one knew where to apply pressure, a lesson that did not go unnoticed by enslaved people and free black communities alike, who observed how whiteness, supposedly immutable, was in practice negotiated behind closed doors. And this observation altered their understanding of power, not as a monolith, but as a series of fragile agreements enforced through violence and secrecy rather than truth. And as that understanding spread, it quietly undermined the moral authority of slaveholders who insisted that the social order was divinely ordained, because divinity does not require erasure, and yet erasure had become the system's primary tool. And nowhere was this contradiction more visible than in the way churches handled these hidden histories, preaching sermons on purity and order, while quietly baptizing individuals whose origins they had been instructed not to question, recording births without parents, confirmations without lineage, and marriages that joined families without acknowledging how precariously those families' identities rested on collective amnesia. And for congregations built on shared belief, this duplicity created a spiritual dissonance that could not be fully resolved, because faith demanded truth, yet survival demanded silence, and ministers learned, as plantation owners had before them, that silence could be rationalized as discretion, discretion as wisdom, and wisdom as moral necessity, a chain of justification that allowed the machinery to continue operating even as it corroded from within. And meanwhile, outside the sanctuaries and courtrooms, everyday life carried on in ways that revealed how deeply the lie had permeated society, because children played together without understanding why certain playmates would one day disappear from their lives, sent away or married off early to prevent questions, and young people formed attachments that were quietly redirected when elders sensed danger, steering courtships toward safer matches without ever explaining why, teaching a generation to obey instinctive caution rather than explicit rules. And this habit of intuitive self-censorship became one of the system's most effective defenses, because it did not require enforcement, it required only fear, and fear had been carefully cultivated over decades through examples of what happened when boundaries were crossed, examples that circulated as cautionary tales rather than official records, stories of families ruined overnight, of reputations destroyed by a single rumor, of individuals who had vanished from polite society and reappeared years later under different names in distant places, and whether these stories were fully true mattered less than the effect they produced, which was compliance, and yet even compliance had its limits, because human memory does not erase itself simply because it is inconvenient, and as elders aged and died, taking with them the personal knowledge that had allowed the lie to function smoothly, gaps began to appear in the collective narrative, gaps that younger generations filled with speculation rather than certainty, and speculation is dangerous because it invites interpretation, and interpretation invites challenge, especially in a period when national tensions over slavery were intensifying and ideological lines were hardening, turning previously unspoken contradictions into potential weapons, and abolitionist pamphlets, sermons, and speeches increasingly referenced cases of racial ambiguity, not as curiosities, but as evidence that the entire system rested on fraud. And while South Carolina's leaders publicly dismissed these claims as Northern propaganda, privately they recognized the vulnerability they exposed, prompting a renewed effort to tighten racial classifications through law, leading to stricter definitions of who could be considered white, how ancestry was to be documented, and which records were admissible as proof, measures that were presented as administrative clarity but functioned in reality as defensive fortifications against a truth that could no longer be entirely suppressed. And these legal changes had immediate consequences for those living under assumed identities, because what had once been tolerated, ambiguity, became a liability, forcing individuals to produce documentation that did not exist or to rely on witnesses who themselves risked exposure by testifying. And in this climate, paranoia flourished, with families scrutinizing one another more closely, alliances strained by mutual suspicion, and the social cohesion that had once masked the lie beginning to fracture. And this fracture revealed something deeply unsettling to those in power, which was that the system's greatest weakness was not external opposition but internal inconsistency, because it had taught people, intentionally or not, that rules could be rewritten if one had the right connections, the right silence, the right leverage, and once that lesson was learned, it could not be unlearned. And as the 1850s progressed, this awareness intersected with broader unrest, including resistance among enslaved populations who saw in these contradictions proof that the world they were forced to endure was neither natural nor permanent. And while overt rebellion remained rare due to brutal repression, quieter forms of resistance multiplied, including strategic alliances, information networks, and the deliberate exploitation of white anxieties, because knowledge, even partial knowledge, became a tool that could destabilize households from within, and thus the legacy of those pale-skinned children extended far beyond their individual lives, seeping into the psychological foundations of the society that had attempted to erase them, transforming what had once been an isolated problem into a pervasive unease that no law or silence could fully contain, setting the stage for a reckoning not just with slavery as an institution, but with the deeper question of how a culture survives after it has invested so much of itself in denying its own contradictions. By the time the contradictions embedded in South Carolina's racial order began to surface with any regularity, the machinery that had once quietly absorbed and concealed them was already straining under the weight of its own complexity, because the children sold as white did not simply vanish into anonymity, as the architects of the system had hoped, but instead moved forward through life carrying invisible fault lines that intersected with nearly every institution that defined Southern society, from property ownership and marriage to militia service and political eligibility, and each intersection generated friction that officials were forced to manage without admitting the true source of the problem, leading to a culture of procedural improvisation where outcomes mattered more than explanations, and explanations were carefully worded to say nothing at all, which in turn created a paper trail riddled with inconsistencies that future clerks, lawyers, and judges would struggle to reconcile, because records that should have aligned did not, and omissions appeared where clarity was expected, and this administrative dissonance became a quiet but persistent reminder that the social order depended not on coherence but on consensus, a consensus increasingly difficult to maintain as more people encountered its cracks firsthand, especially in rural districts where families had longer memories and fewer outsiders, and where a single midwife or county clerk might serve for decades, accumulating knowledge that could not be easily erased when policies changed. And these individuals became unspoken custodians of dangerous truths, aware that a misplaced word or an honest answer could unravel lives, including their own. And so they learned to communicate through implication, through pauses, through what was left unsaid, developing a shared language of evasion that functioned efficiently, only as long as everyone agreed to participate, yet agreement itself grew more fragile as EC. Economic pressures mounted and competition intensified, because land scarcity and declining soil fertility sharpened disputes over inheritance, making lineage a battleground where ambiguity was no longer tolerable, and in these disputes the past resurfaced with an insistence that could not be indefinitely postponed, as rival claimants questioned one another's legitimacy in increasingly explicit terms, forcing courts to confront questions they had long avoided. And while many judges continued to sidestep the issue by focusing narrowly on technicalities, some cases pushed too far to be contained, especially when outside interests became involved, such as creditors demanding clarity on estates or northern investors scrutinizing titles, and these external pressures introduced a different set of expectations into Southern legal culture. Expectations rooted in documentation rather than deference, which made the old strategies of silence and social consensus less effective, and this shift unsettled the planter class profoundly, because it exposed how dependent their authority had always been on local control, and how vulnerable it became when subjected to broader scrutiny, and in response they doubled down on racial orthodoxy in public discourse, delivering speeches and publishing editorials that emphasized immutable difference and natural hierarchy with increasing intensity, as if repetition alone could restore certainty. But beneath this rhetorical surface anxiety spread, manifesting in stricter household surveillance, harsher discipline, and an obsession with appearances that bordered on paranoia, because if whiteness could be questioned retroactively, then no family was entirely safe, and this fear reshaped social behavior in subtle but telling ways, including the increased use of boarding schools to remove children from local scrutiny, the preference for marriages arranged across wider geographic distances, and the growing practice of relocating inconvenient relatives under the guise of opportunity or health, all strategies designed to reduce the accumulation of localized knowledge that might one day be turned into leverage, and leverage, once understood, became a powerful currency in a society built on denial, because those who possessed even fragments of the truth could exert influence disproportionate to their formal status, a reality that both enslaved and free black individuals observed closely, recognizing that the very system that dehumanized them also relied on their silence, and this recognition altered the dynamics of power in ways that slaveholders rarely acknowledged but deeply feared, because silence given freely is not the same as silence enforced, and the difference mattered, especially as resistance took on more covert forms, such as selective disclosure, strategic alliances, and the manipulation of white fears through rumor rather than confrontation, techniques that allowed marginalized people to navigate a hostile environment with a degree of agency that defied the simplistic narratives of total control promoted by the elite. And as these tactics spread, they further destabilized the social order by introducing uncertainty into relationships that had once seemed unassailable, making trust a scarce commodity even among allies, and this erosion of trust had consequences beyond individual interactions, because it weakened the informal networks that had long supported planter dominance, networks built on mutual confidence and shared assumptions, and without that confidence, coordination faltered, leading to miscalculations and overreactions that only intensified existing tensions, and nowhere was this more evident than in the periodic moral panics that swept through communities following the discovery of a single ambiguous individual, because such discoveries triggered disproportionate responses, including investigations, expulsions, and sudden relocations, as if eliminating the visible reminder could restore equilibrium. Yet each episode left behind resentment and suspicion, reinforcing the sense that the system was unstable, and this instability fed into the broader national crisis over slavery, as debates over expansion, states' rights, and federal authority increasingly framed the institution as either a bulwark of order or a source of moral rot. And within this polarized context, the existence of people who confounded racial categories became a rhetorical weapon wielded by both sides, with defenders of slavery portraying them as rare anomalies easily managed, while critics highlighted them as evidence that the entire edifice rested on arbitrary distinctions enforced through violence and deceit. And although South Carolina's leaders dismissed such critiques publicly, privately they recognized that the presence of these individuals complicated any claim to moral clarity, because a system that could not even consistently define its own categories struggled to defend its legitimacy, and this struggle manifested in heightened efforts to codify race through blood fractions and ancestry laws, attempts to fix in statute what had long been negotiated in practice. But law, unlike custom, left records, and records could be examined, compared, and challenged, creating new vulnerabilities even as they sought to close old ones. And for those who had lived as white despite enslaved origins, these legal developments introduced a sense of precariousness that shaped their choices and identities as they learned to perform whiteness with heightened vigilance, avoiding situations that might invite scrutiny, cultivating alliances with powerful protectors, and internalizing a fear of exposure that never fully dissipated, a fear passed down to their children through subtle cues and unspoken rules, creating families bound together not only by blood but by shared secrecy, and this intergenerational transmission of silence became one of the most enduring legacies of the practice, embedding itself in habits of communication and emotional restraint that persisted even after the legal foundations of slavery began to erode, because systems of denial do not dissolve simply because the laws that supported them change. They linger in memory, behavior, and institutional culture, shaping how societies remember and forget. And as the decades passed and the old order collapsed under the weight of war and emancipation, the stories of those children sold as white did not immediately surface as cautionary tales or moral reckonings, but instead receded further into obscurity, buried beneath new narratives of loss and reconstruction, yet their impact remained etched into the social fabric, influencing patterns of segregation, colorism, and identity in ways that would outlast the era that produced them, reminding us that the most profound consequences of injustice are often not the ones recorded in official histories, but those carried quietly through generations, shaping lives in ways that are felt long after the original acts have been forgotten or deliberately erased. As the hidden lives of those children sold as white stretched into adulthood, the most profound transformation occurred not in courthouses or plantations, but within the private interior worlds of the people themselves, because passing was not a single act completed at the moment of sale or reclassification, but a continuous performance that demanded constant vigilance, emotional discipline, and the careful curation of memory. And this psychological labor became heavier with each passing year, as the distance between origin and identity widened and the risk of exposure multiplied through marriage, childbirth, and community involvement, forcing individuals to navigate their own lives as if walking across thin ice that could crack at any moment, because every social interaction carried the possibility of a question asked too casually, a story remembered differently, or a resemblance noticed too closely, and ever-present tension shaped personalities in subtle but enduring ways, producing men and women who were often described as reserved, meticulous, even aloof, traits that contemporaries attributed to refinement or breeding, but which in truth were defenses honed by necessity. Because to reveal too much emotion, too much history, or too much intimacy was to invite scrutiny, and scrutiny was dangerous, especially in small southern towns where gossip functioned as a parallel legal system capable of destroying reputations without evidence. And so these individuals learned early that survival depended not merely on appearance, but on narrative control, on knowing which stories could be told and which must be suppressed, and on mastering the art of redirection when conversations drifted toward ancestry or childhood, a skill passed down like an heirloom to their children, who absorbed these lessons without always understanding their origin, growing up with an instinctive awareness that certain topics were off-limits, that some questions were better left unasked, and that safety lay in conformity, and this inheritance of silence created families that appeared outwardly unremarkable, yet were bound together by an unspoken pact, a collective agreement to protect a truth that could never be spoken aloud, even as it shaped every major decision they made, from where to live to whom to trust. And this internalized secrecy had consequences that extended beyond individual households, because it contributed to a broader culture of emotional repression that permeated white Southern society, reinforcing ideals of stoicism and restraint, while obscuring the trauma that underlay them. And this trauma did not dissipate with time, but adapted, resurfacing in moments of crisis or transition, such as illness, death, or political upheaval, when the carefully maintained structures of daily life were disrupted. And it was often in these moments that the past threatened to intrude, as old records were consulted, wills contested, or family members scattered, creating opportunities for hidden truths to surface despite years of careful management. And when they did, the consequences could be devastating, not only for the individual exposed, but for entire networks of kinship and patronage that had grown around them, because exposure did not merely alter one person's status, it called into question the legitimacy of marriages, inheritances, and alliances, undermining the social fabric itself, which is why communities often responded to such revelations with collective denial rather than investigation, choosing to erase the problem by ostracizing the individual rather than confronting the implications, a strategy that preserved the illusion of order at the cost of justice. And this pattern repeated itself across decades, reinforcing the lesson that truth was less important than stability, and that stability was defined by those with the power to enforce it, Yet even as these mechanisms of suppression functioned effectively on a local level, they could not entirely contain the cumulative impact of countless lives lived in contradiction to the ideology that claimed to govern them, because each person who passed successfully undermined the claim that race was a fixed and visible reality, and although this challenge was rarely articulated explicitly, it was felt intuitively by those who benefited most from the system, fueling an anxiety that manifested in increasingly rigid racial boundaries and harsher enforcement of social norms, as if tightening the rules could compensate for their inherent fragility, and this rigidity, in turn, intensified the cruelty of the system for those who could not escape it, widening the gulf between ideology and lived experience, and creating a society increasingly reliant on coercion rather than consensus, a shift that would have profound consequences as the nation moved toward conflict, because a social order maintained through fear is inherently brittle, prone to fracture under pressure, and when the Civil War erupted, it exposed the extent to which Southern society had been sustained by shared fictions, including the fiction of clear racial boundaries, and as armies marched and governments collapsed, the protections that had shielded those sold as white began to erode, not because their secrets were suddenly revealed, but because the institutions that had enforced silence were themselves disintegrating, leaving individuals to confront a new and uncertain world in which old identities might no longer guarantee safety, and for some, this moment offered an opportunity to redefine themselves on their own terms, to move northward, westward, or abroad, shedding not only their past, but the constant fear that had accompanied it, while for others, the upheaval brought new dangers, as shifting power dynamics made them targets of suspicion from multiple sides, caught between communities that no longer trusted them and a society that no longer knew how to categorize them. And this liminal existence, once managed quietly within a stable hierarchy, became far more precarious in a landscape defined by chaos and reconfiguration, forcing individuals to make choices that would shape their futures and those of their descendants in profound ways, choices about allegiance, disclosure, and belonging that could not be undone. And in these choices we see the enduring legacy of the practice that began with the sale of children as white, because even as slavery ended and legal definitions of race evolved, the psychological and social consequences of those earlier decisions continued to reverberate, influencing patterns of migration, identity formation, and community memory long after the original context had faded, reminding us that history is not merely a sequence of events, but a network of lived experiences that intersect and accumulate over time, shaping the present in ways that are often invisible, yet deeply consequential. And as we move toward the final chapters of this story, it becomes clear that the true impact of those sales cannot be measured solely in economic terms or legal outcomes, but must be understood as a profound distortion of human lives, a distortion that forced individuals to carry the weight of an impossible secret across generations, leaving behind a legacy of silence that still echoes in the unresolved questions and unspoken histories of the American South. As the nation staggered through the aftermath of emancipation and into the long, uneven terrain of Reconstruction, the lives of those who had once been sold as white entered a phase defined less by immediate danger and more by chronic uncertainty, because freedom did not arrive as a clean break, but as a rearrangement of risks, and for individuals whose identities had been built upon concealment, the collapse of the old order removed both the threat that had necessitated passing and the protections that had made it possible, creating a paradox in which liberation exposed them to new forms of vulnerability as racial categories hardened under law even as their moral authority was challenged. And the question of who belonged where became a battleground not only in legislatures but in everyday interactions, where neighbors scrutinized one another with fresh intensity, searching for signs of loyalty, lineage, or betrayal. And in this environment the past could no longer be relied upon to remain buried, because records once scattered across county offices were gathered, standardized, and re-examined, often by officials unfamiliar with local customs of discretion, and this bureaucratic consolidation brought with it a new logic of classification that privileged documentation over reputation, forcing individuals to confront inconsistencies they had long managed through personal relationships and community silence. And while some adapted by producing carefully curated genealogies or relocating to regions where their histories were unknown, others found themselves trapped by paper trails that could not be easily erased, especially when disputes over land or political participation prompted closer scrutiny. And these disputes were frequent, because Reconstruction reshaped property ownership and civic power in ways that unsettled long-established hierarchies, creating opportunities for contestation that drew previously hidden identities into the open, sometimes deliberately, as rivals weaponized ancestry to discredit one another, and sometimes inadvertently, as investigations uncovered details no one had intended to expose. And in these moments, the fragility of passing became starkly apparent, because it depended not on truth, but on alignment between perception and interest, an alignment easily disrupted when incentives shifted. And as white supremacist movements gained momentum in the late 19th century, they brought with them a renewed obsession with purity and exclusion that intensified the stakes of exposure, transforming what had once been a manageable risk into a potentially lethal one, because accusations of hidden black ancestry could provoke violence as readily as legal action, and this threat reshaped behavior in profound ways, encouraging further migration and fragmentation of families as individuals sought safety through distance, severing ties that might lead back to uncomfortable questions. And this dispersal contributed to the gradual erasure of collective memory, as stories were truncated, altered, or abandoned entirely, leaving descendants with fragments rather than narratives, sensations rather than facts, and an intuitive sense of difference they could not explain. And this loss of coherent history had consequences for identity formation, because without access to the truth of their origins, many descendants struggled to understand their own experiences of belonging and alienation, interpreting them through the limited frameworks available in a society still structured by race. And this misrecognition perpetuated cycles of confusion and silence, as questions went unanswered and curiosity was discouraged, reinforcing the idea that safety lay in forgetting rather than remembering. Yet forgetting proved elusive, because memory does not reside solely in stories but in bodies, in the subtle inheritance of features, health patterns, and emotional tendencies that resist erasure. And these embodied traces occasionally disrupted the carefully maintained fiction of whiteness, prompting moments of reckoning that families navigated with varying degrees of honesty and denial, and in some cases, the accumulation of such moments led to a gradual reassessment of identity, particularly in the 20th century as social attitudes shifted and new movements challenged rigid racial binaries, creating spaces where mixed heritage could be acknowledged without immediate peril. And for some descendants, this shift offered a long-delayed opportunity to reclaim suppressed histories and forge connections across the divides that had once defined their lives, while for others, the revelation of ancestral truths proved destabilizing, undermining self-conceptions built over generations and forcing painful confrontations with the legacy of choices made under duress. And these divergent responses underscore the complexity of the practice's long-term impact, because it cannot be reduced to a simple narrative of deception or survival, but must be understood as a series of constrained decisions made within an unjust system that rewarded conformity and punished authenticity, and the moral ambiguity of these decisions continues to resonate, raising difficult questions about responsibility, complicity, and agency that resist easy answers, particularly when viewed through the lens of descendants who inherited both the benefits and burdens of passing without having participated in the original act. And as historians and genealogists began to uncover these rise in greater numbers, they faced their own challenges, navigating ethical considerations about disclosure and representation, and grappling with the temptation to frame such narratives as sensational anomalies rather than integral components of American history. And this tension reflects a broader struggle over how to integrate uncomfortable truths into collective memory without reducing them to spectacle or moralizing from a distance. Because the children sold as white were not symbols but people, whose lives unfolded in all their ordinariness and contradiction, shaped by love, ambition, fear, and resilience, and whose experiences revealed the extent to which race functioned less as a biological reality than as a social contract enforced through violence and silence. And recognizing this reality does not diminish the suffering of those who remained enslaved or marginalized, but rather illuminates the full scope of the system's reach, showing how it distorted relationships and identities across the spectrum. And as we approach the final movement of this story, it becomes clear that the legacy of these hidden lives is not confined to the past, but continues to inform contemporary debates about race, identity, and belonging, challenging us to consider how much of what we accept as natural or inevitable is in fact the product of historical decisions made under coercion, and how acknowledging these origins might open pathways toward a more honest reckoning with the complexities of our shared history. As the echoes of those hidden lives carry forward into the present, the final reckoning with the story of South Carolina's children sold as white does not arrive as a dramatic revelation or a single moment of justice, but as a slow, unsettling realization that the past never truly ended. It merely changed its language, because the legacy of those decisions continues to shape how identity is negotiated, how silence is rewarded, and how power adapts to preserve itself. And when we trace the line from those 19th-century transactions to the modern world, we begin to see how deeply the logic of concealment embedded itself into American culture, teaching generations that survival often depended on presenting a version of oneself that aligned with dominant expectations, even at the cost of erasing truth. And this lesson did not vanish with emancipation or civil rights legislation, but reappeared in subtler forms, influencing everything from housing patterns and employment practices to social mobility and personal relationships, because the idea that some truths are too dangerous to speak remained deeply ingrained. And for descendants of those sold as white, this inheritance manifested as an ambiguous relationship to history itself, a sense that the past was both intimate and inaccessible, present in family mannerisms and anxieties, yet absent from official narratives. And this absence fostered a hunger for understanding that emerged more visibly in recent decades, as advances in genealogy, DNA testing, and historical scholarship provided tools to uncover what had long been hidden, and when these tools were applied, they often revealed stories that complicated cherished identities, forcing individuals and families to confront the dissonance between who they believed themselves to be and what the record suggested. And these confrontations were rarely simple or uniformly welcomed, because they challenged not only personal narratives but collective myths about race, merit, and belonging, and in some cases they provoked resistance rooted in fear rather than malice, fear that acknowledging the past would destabilize the present, reopening wounds that had been carefully scarred over. Yet others embraced these revelations as an opportunity for healing, recognizing that understanding the full truth of one's origins, however painful, could offer a sense of wholeness long denied. And this divergence in response highlights the enduring tension in memory and identity, between the desire for coherence and the reality of complexity, a tension that mirrors the broader national struggle to reckon with slavery's legacy honestly, because just as those children were absorbed into whiteness to preserve a fragile social order, so too has American history often absorbed uncomfortable truths into sanitized narratives that prioritize unity over accuracy. And the cost of this approach is borne not only by those whose stories are erased, but by society as a whole, which remains haunted by unresolved contradictions that resurface in moments of crisis. And as contemporary debates over race, privilege, and systemic inequality continue to unfold, the story of these children offers a crucial lens through which to understand how deeply constructed categories can shape lived experience, revealing that race has always been less about biology than about power, access, and control, enforced through law, custom, and violence, but also through everyday choices that rewarded conformity and punished deviation. And recognizing this does not absolve individuals of responsibility, but it does demand a more nuanced understanding of agency under oppression, acknowledging that choices made in such contexts are rarely free in the way we imagine them to be. And when we extend this understanding backward, we can begin to see the people at the center of this story not as abstractions or curiosities, but as human beings navigating impossible circumstances with the limited options available to them, making decisions that ensured survival even as they perpetuated silence, and this recognition invites empathy without romanticization, allowing us to honor resilience without ignoring the harm inflicted by the system that necessitated it. And as historians continue to uncover these stories, they challenge us to rethink how we define heritage and belonging, urging us to move beyond rigid binaries toward a more inclusive understanding of identity that acknowledges mixture, contradiction, and change as fundamental aspects of the human experience. And this shift has profound implications for how we approach reconciliation, because it suggests that healing does not come from pretending the past was simpler than it was, but from engaging with its full complexity, listening to voices long suppressed, and allowing space for truths that unsettle comfortable narratives. And in this sense, the children sold as white become more than a historical footnote. They become a mirror reflecting the ongoing struggle between truth and power, between memory and forgetting, reminding us that the systems we inherit are shaped by choices made long before we were born, but that we are not powerless in how we respond to them, because telling these stories, listening to them, and refusing to let them disappear again is itself an act of resistance against the forces that sought to erase them. And if this story held you until the end, if it made you pause, question, or see the past differently, then I ask you now to subscribe to Born into Darkness, hit the bell icon so you don't miss the stories history tried to bury, and leave a comment telling me how deeply this story affected you. Because every voice that engages with these hidden histories helps ensure that silence no longer has the final word.